He grabbed her wrist in front of the entire office floor, 32 people watching, not one of them moving, and Kellen Rourke leaned close enough that she could smell the bourbon on his breath at 9 in the morning. You think because he keeps you around, that makes you somebody? His fingers tightened. Your furniture, sweetheart. Expensive furniture he happens to use. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Imani Voss stood completely still, the quarterly ledger pressed flat against her chest like a shield, and she thought about all the ways a woman learns to make herself disappear, when disappearing is the only safe option left. Then the office door opened, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. If you've ever stood in a room where someone had all the power and you had none, if you've ever been the person, everyone watched, but nobody helped stay with me. Because what happened next changed everything. Subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button. And drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't miss what comes next. The morning started the way most mornings started for Imani Voss badly, and with spreadsheets. She arrived at Haniel Pacific Logistics at 7:43, 17 minutes before anyone else on the executive floor, because she had learned a long time ago that the only way to survive in a room where you didn't belong was to arrive before the room filled up. She made the coffee herself. Not because it was her job, technically. The company had a kitchen staff, but because she liked having something to do with her hands in those first quiet minutes before the building woke up and started demanding pieces of her. The office was on the 14th floor of a glass tower in Center City, Philadelphia, and from her desk positioned directly outside the closed mahogany door of the corner office she could see a narrow strip of the Delaware River catching the early light. She never had time to actually look at it during the day. But in those first 17 minutes, she allowed herself to. She was 35 years old. She wore her hair natural, pulled back on workdays, and she'd learned to dress in dark colors because dark colors didn't draw attention. She was black, she was plus size, and she worked for a man whose name alone made grown men careful about what they said in his presence. Baek Do-yun, 41 years old, officially the president and CEO of Haniel Pacific Logistics, a mid-size international shipping operation with contracts across 4 continents and a spotless regulatory record. Unofficially, and this was the part nobody said out loud, not in this building, not anywhere near this building, he was the operational head of one of the most disciplined Korean criminal organizations operating on the eastern seaboard. Imani had not known this when she took the job. That was 18 months ago. She'd been hired as executive secretary, which she'd understood to mean calendar management, correspondence, travel, coordination. The things she'd done for 3 prior employers, competently and without incident. The salary had been generous. The benefits had been exceptional. And her mother's medical debt at that point was sitting at $214,000 after 2 rounds of treatment and a hospital stay that insurance had covered approximately 40% of. So she took the job. Gradually, the way you learn that a body of water is deeper than it looks not by diving in, but by standing at the edge long enough to notice what surfaces. The first thing she noticed was the second set of accounts. They appeared in a file she'd been handed to reconcile during her 3rd week, buried inside a legitimate vendor reconciliation document. And for approximately 40 seconds, she sat very still and looked at numbers that didn't belong to a shipping company. Then she closed the file, returned it to Do-yun's desk, with a note indicating the reconciliation was complete, and went home and sat in her car in the parking garage for 22 minutes before she could make her hands stop shaking enough to drive. She went back the next morning, and the morning after that. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she would leave once her mother's debt was manageable. She told herself lots of things sitting at that desk with the narrow strip of river behind her, and most of them were probably true when she thought them. The thing about Baek Do-yun that nobody told her the thing she had to discover herself, and with considerable reluctance, was that he was not what she'd expected. She had expected cold. She had expected distance. She had expected a man who looked through people rather than at them, which was what most powerful men did with their staff, particularly with staff like her. Instead, she got a man who noticed things, small things, the wrong things in some ways. He noticed when she skipped lunch, which she did sometimes when the workload compounded and eating felt like a luxury she hadn't earned yet. On those days, food appeared on her desk. Not delivered with fanfare, she would simply look up, and there would be a container from the Korean place 3 blocks over, still warm, positioned beside her keyboard with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested he'd arranged without want her to make anything of it. He noticed when employees laughed at her. The first time it happened, she was new, and 2 of the junior operations staff said something in the break room that she was not meant to hear, but Do-yun had been in the hallway. She never saw exactly what he said to them, but they apologized to her the following morning in the specific way that people apologize when the alternative has been made very clear. He read every report she prepared, not skimmed, read. And once, early on, when she had caught a cascading error in a set of quarterly projections that would have created significant regulatory exposure, he had come out of his office, set the corrected report on her desk, and said 4 words. Nobody else caught that. It was not effusive. It was not warm. But it was the most direct acknowledgement of her competence she had received from any employer, and she remembered it longer than she should have. 6 months ago, everything got complicated. A federal financial crimes investigation had quietly begun circling Hanul Pacific, not close enough to land, but close enough to make the wrong people nervous. Do-yun's accountant, a man named Seo, who had handled the sensitive work for 11 years, disappeared. Not dramatically. He was simply not at his desk on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday it became clear he would not be returning, and no one asked questions about why. That left a hole in the financial architecture that was days away from becoming a catastrophic regulatory exposure. Imani had spent 2 nights in this office. She had consumed an amount of coffee that she was not proud of, and consumed it out of a paper cup because she kept forgetting to bring her mug back from the break room. She had reconstructed records from partial documentation, cross-referenced 3 sets of accounts that were not supposed to cross-reference, built a clean audit trail that would survive a reasonable regulatory review, a sound like green wood splitting, and generally done the work of 3 people in 48 hours because the alternative was watching a structure that employed 72 legitimate workers collapse under the weight of an accountant's disappearance. She had expected afterward that she would be next. She had been, she realized later, entirely wrong about what came next. Do-yun doubled her salary, moved her desk to its current position, directly outside his office, gave her access to everything, not the ledger book everything she'd already found, but the real everything, the full architecture of accounts, the shell companies, the offshore arrangements, the legitimate business interwoven with the other kind in a structure. So careful and precise. It was almost beautiful in the way that complicated things sometimes are when someone genuinely gifted has built them. He trusted her with all of it and said nothing about it. Just opened the access and went back to his meetings. That was the part she couldn't explain to herself in the 6 months since. Not the access that was practical. What she couldn't explain was why it made her feel, underneath the fear and the constant low-grade awareness of what she was doing and what it made her, something that she reluctantly identified as seen. She was still telling herself she would leave. She had a number in her head, the remaining balance on her mother's debt, plus a cushion, plus enough to relocate somewhere quiet, where the name Baek Do-yun would mean nothing to anyone. She was 8 months from that number. Maybe 7, if the quarterly bonuses came through. 7 months. She could survive 7 months. That was the calculation she was running in her head at 7:56 in the morning when the elevator opened and Kellen Rourke walked onto the executive floor. She felt him before she saw him. That was not intuition or anything mystical. It was the sound of the other employees reorganizing themselves, the subtle shift in posture and attention that happened whenever someone with enough power entered a space. Kellen Rourke was Do-yun's underboss. Officially, he held a vice president title in the company's operations division. Unofficially, he was the man who managed the parts of the organization that required a different kind of management, and he had been doing it for 6 years. And he had decided approximately 4 months ago that he had been doing it long enough to deserve more than he currently had. Imani knew this because numbers told her. Not rumors, not whispers, not the careful half-conversations she heard through the mahogany door. numbers. The financial architecture of a criminal organization, she had learned, was not unlike the financial architecture of any other organization. Money moved toward power, and when someone inside the structure started quietly redirecting money toward themselves, it left marks if you knew where to look. She had been watching the marks for 4 months. She had not yet told Do-yun. She was still deciding what the responsible version of this decision was, which was a genuinely difficult question when the word responsible was already doing some heavy lifting. Kellen came onto the floor with 2 men she didn't recognize, which was itself a signal. He normally traveled alone inside the day. The 2 men were large and stood slightly behind him and to the sides, and they looked at the office the way people look at places they're already planning to redecorate. He walked directly to her desk. She kept her eyes on her screen. The quarterly ledger was open. She had been working. She had not stopped working when he came in. "Where is he?" Kellen said. "Mr. Do-yun has a conference call until 9:30, she said. "If you'd like to schedule." I didn't ask about his schedule. Kellen leaned one hand on the edge of her desk. It was a specific kind of lean the kind, designed to remind you whose space it actually was, or at least whose space this person believed it to be. "I asked where he is. I just told you where he is." The 2 men behind Kellen exchanged a look. One of them almost smiled. Kellen's eyes moved slowly over her, not with attraction, which would have been uncomfortable enough. With assessment. The kind of look that measured what something was worth and found the number insulting. "He's got you running his books now." It wasn't a question. "A secretary. Running actual books. I'm an executive administrator." "You're a secretary," Kellen said. "And you should probably stay in your lane, sweetheart, before you end up in the same situation as the last person who ran those books." The office was very quiet. She could feel the 32 people on the floor, the operations staff, the junior associates, 2 paralegals who were technically there for the logistics division's legal compliance work, not looking at her. The specific quality of not looking that meant everyone was paying very close attention. Her hands were flat on the keyboard. She had not moved them. "If you'd like to schedule time with Mr. Do-yun," she said, "I can check his afternoon." Kellen reached past her and picked up the quarterly ledger. She stood up. It was involuntary. Her body made the decision before she consciously decided anything, some part of her that apparently had opinions about someone handling her work. Kellen looked at her standing and seemed to find this genuinely amusing. He turned the ledger over in his hands. He was not reading it. It wasn't his kind of reading, but he was making a point about who could pick it up. "Sit down," he said. She didn't sit down. That was when he reached for her wrist. His grip was not gentle. It was the grip of someone who had grabbed wrists before and knew how much pressure it took to make a point. The ledger was still in his other hand. He pulled her forward, slightly just enough, and leaned down so his face was close to hers. "You think because he keeps you around," Kellen said, quietly enough that it was almost private between them, "that makes you somebody." His eyes moved over her again, and she understood that he was categorizing her, filing her away under labels she'd spent her entire adult life fighting. "Your furniture, sweetheart. Expensive furniture he happens to use." And when he's done using it, the office door opened. She had not heard it. Nobody had heard it. The mahogany door swung open without a sound, which meant he had not thrown it. He had opened it with the deliberate control of someone who had been standing on the other side for long enough to hear most of what had been said. Baek Do-yun stood in the doorway. He was not large in the way that Kellen's men were large. He was lean, contained. The kind of person whose size was entirely irrelevant because something about how he occupied space made the room smaller. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, and the expression on his face was very specific kind of nothing that meant he was deciding what happened next. Kellen let go of her wrist. Do-yun looked at Imani first. 1 second. Long enough to be sure she was standing, that she was whole, that nothing was wrong in the way that things could be wrong. Then his eyes moved to Kellen. "Step away from her desk," he said. Just that, no elevation in his voice, no theatrical display. The tone was the same one he used when he told her to move a meeting by 20 minutes, quiet, complete, and utterly without the possibility of a different outcome. Kellen set the ledger down. He smiled, which was worse than anything else he'd done since walking in. Do-yun, I came to talk. My office. Do-yun held the door open. He did not look at Imani again. He did not need to. Whatever needed to be communicated had already been communicated in that single second of eye contact, which was the most exposed she had felt in months, and also, oddly, the most steadied. Kellen walked past her without looking at her again. The two men stayed outside the door. Do-yun closed it in their faces. The floor let out a breath. Imani sat down. She picked up the quarterly, a ledger, and straightened it against the desk and set it back where it belonged. Looked at her screen. And for a moment, the numbers swam slightly because her hands were shaking, and she needed them to stop. The shaking stopped. She breathed. She told herself she was fine. Behind the mahogany door, the conversation lasted approximately 4 minutes before it stopped being a conversation. She heard the first impact something heavy, hitting something solid, and her fingers paused over her keyboard. The floor had gone back to the careful busyness of people pretending they weren't listening. But they were all listening. The shouting came next. Kellen's voice, mostly she couldn't make out words, but the pitch was the pitch of someone who had prepared a speech and found the audience unresponsive. Then something that sounded like furniture, and then glass, distinct and sharp. Then silence. Then more sounds that she categorized, and immediately stopped categorizing because the categories were frightening. When Kellen came through the door 7 minutes later, he was bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow and holding his left arm at an angle that suggested the shoulder was wrong. One of his men moved to catch him. The other one looked at the door. Kellen pointed at the door. His voice had lost its performance. What was underneath was rawer, and Imani thought more honest than anything he'd said in the past 20 minutes. Everyone in this building, he said, is going to pay for this. He left. His men went with him. 32 people sat very still. Imani stood up, walked to the mahogany door, knocked twice, and opened it without waiting for an answer, because she had a feeling an answer might not be coming. He was against the far wall. Not dramatically, he hadn't slid down it in the cinematic way. He was simply sitting with his back against the wall and his legs extended in front of him, and his right hand was pressed below his left ribs. And the dark color of his suit was doing some work to obscure what was underneath his hand, but not enough work. The office was destroyed in the specific way of places, where a fight was ugly and efficient rather than theatrical. A chair overturned, the glass from a credenza that someone had apparently met with considerable force. Papers everywhere. Imani stood in the doorway and looked at him, and felt simultaneously the strong and entirely rational urge to turn around and leave this building and keep walking, the knowledge that she was not going to do that, and an anger that surprised her, directed not at Do-yun but at the situation, at all of it, at the 18 months that had led her to a place where a man was bleeding on an office floor and she was the one standing in the doorway. How bad, she said, manageable. His voice was level. It was always level. She had never heard him speak from pain, not in 18 months. That's not an answer. It's a knife wound. The depth is... He stopped. Breathed, manageable. She walked across the destroyed office. She crouched down in front of him and pulled his hand away from his side, far enough to look at what was underneath. And the wound was bad enough that she sat back on her heels for a second and did the thing she always did when information was alarming. Filed it, processed it, moved to the next step. Hospital, she said. No. Do no hospital. His eyes were clear, she noticed. He was in pain and managing it the way he managed everything by simply deciding that the pain was not in charge of this situation. There's a kit. Left-hand drawer of the secondary desk. Black case. She stood up. She found the kit. It was not a standard first aid kit. It was the kind of kit that someone put together who had anticipated specific kinds of injuries in environments where hospitals were not a viable option, which told her something about the life she had been adjacent to for 18 months that she'd managed to successfully not think about too clearly until this moment. She came back, opened the case, laid out what she needed. This is going to hurt, she said. I know. She worked. Her hands were steady. She hadn't expected that, and it struck her as odd, the way that the shaking from earlier in the morning was completely gone now, and she was doing something objectively more difficult with entirely steady hands. She had taken a first aid course 3 years ago. She was operating considerably outside its scope. Do-yun made no sound. Once he exhaled sharply, and that was all. At some point during the process, she wasn't sure when exactly he said, "Why didn't you run?" She didn't look up from what she was doing. "What?" "When you opened the door, you saw the room. Why didn't you run?" She applied pressure, counted silently. "I don't know." "That's not true." She looked up at that. He was watching her with the same expression he used when he read her report's attention, assessment, a careful kind of interest. "You know exactly why," he said. "You just don't like the answer." She looked back down and kept working and did not respond because he was right, and she did not like the answer. She finished bandaging him. It was not elegant work. She was not a nurse, but it was competent, and it would hold. And when she sat back and looked at what she'd done, she felt the specific satisfaction of a problem managed, even though the larger situation was still catastrophically unmanaged. "I quit," she said. He looked at her. "I'm quitting. I'll finish this week's reconciliation. I'll document the handover. Imani, don't." She started packing the kit back. Her hands were still steady. She noticed this again, and found it almost funny in the way that things that aren't become funny when you've moved past the point of processing them correctly. "I know what you're going to say. I know you're going to explain why I can't leave, and you're probably right. And I want you to know that I understand that, and I'm still quitting." "Kellen knows your name," Do-yun said. "He knows you run the books. He knows what you mean to the operation. I know. He will find you, regardless of whether you're employed here. I know that too, so leaving makes you unprotected." "I know." She set the kit to the side. She looked at him. "I know all of that, and I'm still telling you that I want out of this. Because you almost died on your office floor, and I just spent 20 minutes stopping your bleeding, and I am shaking." She stopped. She had not intended to say that. She looked at her hands, which were, in fact, now shaking again. "I am shaking," she said again, more quietly, "and I've been shaking for months, and I need you to understand that." He was quiet. "I don't want this life," she said. "I know," he said. And there was something in those two words that she hadn't heard from him before. Not apology, exactly. Something more complicated. "I know you don't." She stood up. He needed to move. She needed to get him somewhere that wasn't a destroyed office with a man bleeding against the wall. She needed to think about the next steps in the logical order that she applied to every problem, because logic was the only thing currently between her and genuine panic. "Can you walk?" "Yes, I'm taking you somewhere safe." "Not because I'm staying. Because leaving you bleeding here would be—" She stopped. "Unacceptable to you," he finished. "Yes." He let her help him up. It cost him, she felt that, the effort of the movement and the pride that he managed it with anyway. She grabbed her bag from its hook and her coat from the rack, and she did not stop to log off her computer or close the quarterly ledger or do any of the small completion tasks that she normally could not leave undone. They went out through the back elevator. And she drove him in her car, and the safe house was a small place in a suburb outside the city that she had not known existed until he told her the address. It was a modest house on a quiet street, nothing that announced itself, which was probably the point. She got him inside and onto the couch, and he sat there with the particular stillness of someone managing pain by refusing to move more than necessary. She stood in the middle of the living room and looked around, and then looked at him. "You own this. The company does." "The company." She meant the other company. He understood. She went and found water in the kitchen. The house was stocked. She noticed, which meant someone maintained it, and she came back and sat in the chair across from him, and they looked at each other in the quiet. She noticed, in the way you notice things, when the adrenaline starts to drain and your brain moves back to regular processing, that he was looking at her in a way she couldn't entirely categorize. Not the assessment that Kellen had used, nothing like that. Something spelling. Something more personal and less comfortable, because personal attention from this man was something she had been carefully managing her response to for 18 months. "You did that," he said, "with your hands still shaking." "My hands stopped shaking when there was something to do." "Yes." He seemed to find this significant. They always do. She looked away. Through the window, the street was normal and suburban, and utterly ordinary, and she thought about how strange it was to be in this completely ordinary room with this situation wrapped around everything like weather. She noticed she was sitting with her shoulders drawn in, her coat still on, her arms folded in the specific. When she was aware of taking up space, she wasn't sure she was entitled to. She'd been doing it her whole life, making herself smaller at desks, at tables, in rooms where her body had been the first thing people saw and dismissed. The habit was so deep she did it, without noticing most of the time. He noticed. Of course he noticed. "You drove us here," he said. "You stopped my bleeding. You didn't panic once. I panicked internally. That doesn't count. It counts to me." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Stop." She looked at him. "The way you're sitting," he said. "Stop apologizing for taking up space, Imani." The sentence hit something she hadn't been expecting to have hit, and she felt it in the specific way of things that are true, and therefore sting. She pulled her coat tighter. "I'm not your partner," she said. "I'm your hostage. You drove here voluntarily, because you explained that leaving made me a target. So you made a rational choice with available information." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "That's not being a hostage. Don't do that." "Do what?" "Make the thing I'm angry about sound like a compliment." She looked at him squarely. "I am in this situation because I needed money and I made choices that I can't fully take back. And now a dangerous man knows my name because of the work I do for a different dangerous man. And I just want to be clear that I understand that." He held her gaze. "Good. Good? I'd rather you understand it clearly than pretend otherwise." He shifted slightly and caught his breath, and the shift reminded her that he was injured, and that injury was real and present. "There's something I need to show you," he told her about the laptop. It was in the secondary bedroom she retrieved it, and he gave her the access credentials and told her to open a specific file, and she sat at the kitchen table and opened the file and looked at what was inside. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at him, where he was watching her from the doorway to the living room, one hand on the frame because standing was still costing him. "This is Kellen's money," she said. "Yes." She looked back at the screen. The file contained the architecture of another financial structure, different from Do-yun's, sloppier in some ways and more aggressive in others. The fingerprints of someone who had watched a careful builder work for years and had convinced himself he'd learned the lesson. He hadn't learned the lesson. She could see 3 different vulnerabilities from where she was sitting, and she was only on the first page. "You're not showing me this so I understand the situation," she said. "No. You're showing me this because you want me to do something with it." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She looked at the screen for another long moment. Outside, the street was quiet. Somewhere, Kellen Rourke was bleeding from a cut above his eye and making promises to people about what happened next. She thought about the quarterly ledger, still open on her desk, 14 floors up. She thought about the number, in her head the amount she needed before she could walk away. She thought about 7 months, and what 7 months meant now, with Kellen knowing her name and her face and her value to this operation. She did not close the laptop. She did not close the laptop. That was the decision, though she didn't frame it as one. She simply left it open and looked at the numbers, and let her brain do what her brain did, which was find the architecture inside complicated things and understand how they were built, and, by extension, how they could come apart. Kellen Rourke's financial structure was not elegant. That was the first thing. Do-yun's books had a kind of precision to them, everything balanced, everything justified. The legitimate, and the illegitimate woven together with the patience of someone who had spent years learning how regulators thought and built his concealment accordingly. Kellen's structure was different. It was fast. It was greedy in the specific way of someone who had watched careful work being done and had decided that the careful part was optional. She could see the bones of it within 10 minutes. She could see the vulnerabilities within 20. She did not say any of this out loud. Do-yun had gone back to the couch standing in the doorway, had cost him more than he'd shown, and she could hear him from the kitchen, the quality of his silence, telling her he was managing pain by staying very still. She closed the laptop. She was not ready to have that conversation yet. She made tea instead, because the kitchen had tea, and because she needed to do something with her hands that wasn't processing what she'd just seen. The kettle was new. The mugs were mismatched. Somebody had stocked this place with the particular randomness of someone doing a practical job rather than making a home. She brought 2 mugs out, set one on the table beside him without asking. Sat back in the chair across from the couch. He picked up the mug. He looked at it briefly, the way people look at something unexpected when they're too tired to manage their reactions properly. Then he drank. The house was quiet. Outside it was full morning now. She could hear birds, which felt genuinely surreal. "How many people know about this place?" she asked. 3, one is you. Who are the other 2? People who are not Kellen. She accepted this. He's going to move fast. Yes. He came in this morning with 2 men I didn't recognize. That means he had outside personnel already positioned. He wasn't improvising. Do-yun's eyes moved to her. "You notice them. I notice everything. That's literally what you pay me for." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "He's been planning this longer than this morning. Probably longer than this week." 4 months, Do-yun said. She went still. "You knew, I suspected, 4 months ago. I noticed irregularities in the operational fund distributions." He paused. "I was waiting for confirmation." Confirmation. She heard the edge come into her own voice and didn't pull it back. "You were waiting for confirmation while he was planning." She stopped. Started again. "He grabbed my wrist this morning." "I know, in front of 32 people. I know, Imani. And you've been watching him for 4 months. She set the mug down on the table beside her chair. "Did it occur to you that a warning might have?" A warning would have accelerated his timeline. His voice was still level, but something underneath it had shifted. "He needed to believe I didn't see him moving. If he knew I was watching, he would have acted before I was ready." Ready. She looked at him. "You got stabbed." "The knife was a surprise," he said, and there was something in that sentence that was almost dry, almost wry, which under different circumstances might have been funny. "He's better in close quarters than I calculated." "What else have you miscalculated?" The question sat in the air between them. He looked at her steadily. "Say what you actually mean." "I mean exactly what I said." She leaned forward. "What else?" "Because if Kellen had outside men already positioned, and you only knew the safe house address, and there are only 3 people who know we're here, what's the margin on how long that stays true?" He was quiet for a moment that was longer than a simple pause. "Shorter than I'd like." "How short?" "Hours. Possibly less if he moves the resources I expect him to move." She breathed in, out. The birds outside were still making ordinary bird sounds, indifferent to the fact that a man with a knife wound was sitting on a couch 10 feet away, calculating his survival window. "The laptop," she said, "yes. Show me the access you have. All of it. Not what you chose to show me all of it." He told her the credentials. All of them this time. Not the curated version. She could tell the difference because the curated version had been one file, and this was an entire directory structure that opened up like a set of nested boxes, each one containing something more specific and more damning than the last. She looked at it for a long time. "He's been moving money out for 8 months, she said. "Not 4. Do-yun said nothing. "The pattern in the operational funds is 4 months old. But there's an earlier structure underneath it, smaller amounts, less obvious, consistent with someone who was testing the water before committing." She scrolled. "He started 8 months ago." Carefully. "Then 3 months ago, something changed and he accelerated." "What changed 3 months ago?" She found it without looking up. "You gave me access to the main accounts." The silence was different this time. "He saw it," she said. "He saw that you'd brought me fully inside. And he read it as..." She stopped. She was doing the thing where she worked through something out loud and occasionally got ahead of what she was comfortable saying. "He read it as a succession problem." "Explain that." "He's been your underboss for 6 years. He's managed the parts of the operation that require a certain kind of management. He's been building towards something you can see it in the financial trajectory. The accounts he's been building externally aren't operational. They're exit accounts. He was planning to leave, but not quietly." She finally looked up. "He was planning to take something with him when he went. The organization. Or enough of it to start his own." "Yes." She turned the laptop so he could see the screen, not because he needed to read the numbers, but because the gesture felt necessary. He saw you bring me in, and he read it as you choosing your successor. And that moved his timeline. Do-yun looked at the screen, then at her. You're right, I know I'm right. She pulled the laptop back. What I don't know is what you want me to do with it. What are you capable of doing with it? She looked at him for a long moment. The question was genuine, she could see that. Not a test, not a manipulation. An actual question about an actual capability asked by someone who had already seen her work and was asking for scope. She thought about what she'd seen in the files. She thought about the 3 vulnerabilities she'd identified in the first 10 minutes and the 2 more she'd found in the next 10, and the cascading implications of each one. I can dismantle it, she said, not physically, financially. The people who work for Kellen work for him because he pays them. The politicians he owns stay owned because of consistent, reliable payment. The shell corporations that protect his exposure exist because someone is maintaining them. She closed the laptop. If the money stops, the loyalty stops. If the corporate structures collapse, the protection collapses. He becomes just a man with a knife wound and a very bad morning. Do-yun looked at her with that expression she'd been managing her response to for 18 months. The one saw her clearly and refused to look away from what it saw. And the consequences to you, he said, of doing that. She had thought about this in the 20 minutes of looking at files. She had thought about it the way she thought about everything difficult systematically, honestly, without softening the edges. So I become someone who dismantled a criminal organization's financial infrastructure, she said, which makes me either a federal asset or a criminal, depending on who asks the question and what day it is. She paused. It also makes me someone Kellen will never stop being angry at, regardless of whether he has any resources left to act on that anger. Yes. You should have led with that when you showed me the laptop. I wanted you to understand it yourself. His voice was quieter. I don't want you making this decision because I explained it to you. I want you making it because you understand the full shape of it. She stood up. She needed to move sitting, still was becoming difficult in the specific way of being in a room with a problem she could solve and choosing not to solve it yet. She walked to the window and looked out at the suburban street, which was still aggressively ordinary. My mother's debt, she said. I know about it. She turned. What? $83,000. Remaining balance as of last month. He held her gaze. It's the reason you stayed. It's the reason you came back every morning for 18 months. She felt the exposure of that, the particular discomfort of someone naming the thing you've been holding privately, the mechanism of your own decision-making laid out in plain language. You had someone look into me before you were hired. Standard practice. And you've been watching the number go down. Yes. She looked at him. That's a violation, yes, he said again simply, without defense. It is. I'm telling you because you deserve to know, not because I'm asking for absolution. He paused. I also knew that when the number reached 0, I would lose you. The birds outside, the ordinary street, the mismatched mugs on the table. You should have told me, she said. I know. I need you to understand that that particular brand of honesty, watching someone's private circumstances and using that information without telling them, that's not protection. That's control. I know that too. Something in his face for the first time since she'd met him was not managed. Not perfectly contained. I understand that now more clearly than I did. She turned back to the window. She needed to not look at him directly when she was thinking about something real, because looking at him directly while thinking about something real had become difficult to do, without it meaning more than she wanted it to mean. What happens to the legitimate employees? She asked. If I do this, the 72 people who work in the actual logistics operation. Hanul Pacific is a real company. It has real contracts and real clients and real revenue. The legitimate operation survives without Kellen. And the other operation reorganizes, he said carefully. Under a restructured model, yes. With me. It was not quite a question. He heard it that way regardless. Only if you choose it, he said. Not because of circumstance. Not because Kellen makes the alternative dangerous. Because you choose it. She pressed 2 fingers against the window glass. The glass was cool. Outside, a woman walked a dog past the house, completely unaware that any of this was happening, which was its own particular commentary on how much of the world was always completely unaware of what was happening 10 feet away. "Sit down," she said. "You're in pain and you're standing again, and you're going to tear something." She heard him after a moment move back to the couch. She stood at the window a while longer. Then she went back to the kitchen table, opened the laptop, and started working. She worked for 3 hours without stopping. Do-yun slept not comfortably, she thought, but sufficiently, and she sat at the kitchen table with the laptop and a yellow legal pad she'd found in a drawer, and she mapped it. All of it. The full architecture of Kellen's financial structure, traced from its visible surface down to its roots, and beside each element she noted the intervention point and the expected cascade. It was the most complicated financial mapping she had ever done. It was also, she recognized with a kind of grim clarity, the best work she had ever done. She was on her 4th page of notes when her phone rang. She did not recognize the number. She looked at it for 2 rings, then answered. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for." Kellen's voice. Controlled now, the edge of the morning filed down. He had regrouped faster than she'd expected, getting him out of the building. That was quick thinking. She said nothing. "Is he alive?" "What do you want, Kellen?" "I want a conversation." A pause. "Not with him, with you. We're having one, a real one." His voice shifted, not warmer exactly, but more precise. The performance quality fell away, and what replaced it was someone making an actual business argument. "You're smart enough to see what's happening here. He's built something. I want what he's built. You're the person who actually understands how it works." Another pause. "There's a version of this where you come out better than you're currently positioned. You grabbed my wrist this morning. I was making a point. You were making a point to him, using me." Her voice was level. She was proud of how level it was. "That's not a version I'm interested in. I'll pay you more than he does. He pays me very well. I'll pay you more than that. And when this is over and I'm running the operation, you won't be a secretary anymore. You'll have an actual position." "Something I already have an actual position," she said. "I keep his empire alive. That's not a secretary. That's an architect." She looked at her notes. "The cascade maps, the intervention points. You never understood what I do in that office. You saw a desk and a woman sitting behind it, and you stopped looking." Silence on his end. "That's the problem with you," she said. "You understand violence. You don't understand infrastructure." She closed the laptop with one hand. "Don't call this number again." She hung up. She sat very still for a moment. Then she picked up the legal pad and the pen and went back to her notes. Do-yun woke when his phone buzzed the 2nd time. The first time she had ignored it on his behalf, he'd left it on the table when he'd gone to sleep, and whoever called had not left a message. The 2nd call, 20 minutes later, came with a text that preceded it, and she had looked at the text because the screen was facing up, and she was sitting 2 feet away. The text said, "He moved on the warehouse. 3 of ours." She picked up the phone and brought it to him. He read the text with the stillness of someone who had received bad news before and knew how to receive it without reacting in the wrong direction. He sat up carefully, she noticed, bracing the wound, and called back. The conversation was in Korean. She didn't speak Korean, but she had spent 18 months listening to the cadences of Do-yun's professional voice in multiple contexts, and she had developed a working understanding of what tone meant what outcome. This tone was tightly controlled and very cold. He hung up. "Kellen moved faster than you expected," she said. "Yes. Warehouse, 1 of 3. The others are compromised by association now, same security pattern." He set the phone down. He was doing the calculation she could see in his face, the calculation of losses, of resource positions, of what this attack meant about Kellen's remaining capability. "He's more liquid than I thought. He didn't put everything in those accounts. He was expecting me to look," she said. Do-yun looked at her sharply. "He called me," she said, 20 minutes ago. He offered me money." The quality of Do-yun's attention, already considerable, became something closer to absolute. What did you tell him? I told him he doesn't understand infrastructure. She held his gaze. He wanted me to confirm you were alive and what condition you were in. The offer was secondary. You know that. I've been studying the way people use information for 18 months. Yes, I know that. She looked at the phone. He doesn't know where this house is. But he knew I answered a phone number he shouldn't have had. Which means someone gave him a contact. One of the three. Or someone peripheral. Someone who knew the number but not the location. She picked up the legal pad. It narrows his source, which means his network inside your organization is smaller than he wants you to think. Do-yun looked at the legal pad. He looked at the cascade maps she'd built 3 pages of them, dense and cross-referenced, with the intervention points circled in red. You built this while I was sleeping, he said. I had time. He reached for the legal pad slowly, and she let him take it. He read it carefully. She watched him read it and saw the moment he understood the full scope, not just one page, but the pattern of all 4, the way the interventions cascaded into each other, the efficiency of the sequence. If you execute this, he said, his organization is financially non-operational within 6 hours, maybe less, depending on reaction time in the offshore structures. The Cayman accounts have a lag window that works in our favor. She took the legal pad back. But I need you to understand something before we talk about executing it. Tell me, if I do this, I am not doing it for the organization. I am not doing it because you need it done, or because it keeps me safe, or because Kellen made me angry this morning, even though he did. She set the legal pad on the table with a precision that was its own kind of statement. I'm doing it because it is the correct solution to a problem that is endangering people I have decided I'm not willing to leave endangered. She saw something shift in his face. Not surprise he didn't do surprise. Something quieter. Including me, he said. She did not answer that directly. I have conditions. Tell me the conditions. When this is over, when Kellen is neutralized and the immediate threat is gone, I get to decide what comes next. Not you, not the situation me, she held his gaze. If I stay, it's because I chose to stay. If I leave, that option is real and available, and you don't make it more complicated than it is. Yes, and I'm not sitting behind that desk anymore. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. What position would you prefer? I don't know yet. Something accurate. She opened the laptop. The cascade maps were still in her head, vivid and specific. Get some rest. In a few hours, I'm going to need quiet, and you breathing steadily in the background, which is admittedly a strange requirement. But there it is. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in the look that she was going to have to think about later, when there was time for thinking about things that were not immediate and tactical and frightening. Imani, he said. Not now, she said, later. When this is done. He was quiet. Then he settled back against the couch cushions, and she heard him breathe slowly, deliberately, the breathing of someone choosing to rest rather than someone able to rest naturally, and she turned back to the laptop and the legal pad and the work. Outside, the afternoon was starting. Somewhere across the city, Kellen Rourke was spending money he didn't have much left of and making promises he was running out of the resources to keep. She opened the first account access. Her hands were completely steady. She began. She opened the first account access and started with the smallest structure. That was how she always worked. Not from the top down, but from the edges in, because edges told you how something was built, and the center told you only what someone wanted you to see. Kellen's financial architecture had a center that looked like a legitimate freight brokerage registered in Delaware. She ignored the center entirely and went to the periphery, where 3 accounts in a Portuguese banking subsidiary were receiving consistent monthly transfers from what appeared to be a consulting firm in Singapore. The consulting firm did not have a website. Its registered address was a mail forwarding service. Its sole listed director had a name that appeared in no other corporate filing in any jurisdiction she had access to, which meant the name was constructed rather than inherited. She noted this on the legal pad and moved to the next layer. Do-yun's breathing from the couch was even. He was not asleep, she could tell the difference, but he was still managing himself the way he managed everything, with the disciplined patience of someone who had learned that stillness was its own form of action. She found his presence useful in a way she didn't examine too closely. The alternative was being alone in a strange house, doing something irreversible, and that alternative had a texture she preferred not to think about. The second layer took 40 minutes. Inside it, she found the operational payment structure, the mechanism by which Kellen paid the people who worked for him outside of Do-yun's organization. 14 individuals receiving regular transfers through a rotating series of LLCs. The LLCs were all registered in states with minimal reporting requirements. 4 of them shared the same registered agent, which was the kind of corner cutting that happened when someone was building fast and didn't expect anyone to ever look this carefully. She circled those 4. The third layer was the political money, which was both the most interesting and the most delicate. 3 city council members, 1 state representative, a deputy director in the regional port authority whose signature appeared on every Hanul Pacific inspection waiver for the past 4 years. The payments to these individuals did not come directly from anything with Kellen's fingerprints. On it, they came through a nonprofit organization dedicated to workforce development in underserved communities, which had a functioning website, a board of directors, and annual galas attended by people whose photographs appeared in the business section of the Philadelphia Inquirer. She sat with this for a moment. The nonprofit was clean on its surface. It had done some actual work she could see, grant disbursements to legitimate community organizations, program expenses that matched reported activities. Someone had built it carefully. Not Kellen. Kellen didn't build things carefully. Someone had built it for him, years ago, and he had been using it ever since. She wrote the nonprofit's name at the top of a fresh page and started working backward through its funding sources. At 11:47 p.m., she found the source. She stared at it for a long time. Long enough that Do-yun, from the couch, said, "What did you find?" "Give me a minute." She checked it twice, then a third time, approaching from a different angle, pulling the funding thread from a different end to see if it led to the same place. "Imani. The nonprofit," she said. Her voice came out flat. "The one Kellen uses to route political payments." "I know the one. Its primary funding source, the one that made it viable from the beginning, that gave it enough legitimacy to operate, is a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands." She paused. "The holding company's beneficial owner is recorded in a fiduciary document I'm looking at right now." She turned the laptop so he could see it from the couch. "Do you want to tell me whose name that is?" He stood up from the couch. He crossed the room slowly, favoring his left side, and looked at the screen. She watched his face. His face did nothing. That was more frightening than any reaction would have been. "Park Sung-jin," he said. "Your CFO," she said. "The man who has been running Hanul Pacific's legitimate financial operations since the company was incorporated. The man whose signature is on every major financial document the company has ever filed." She closed the laptop. "The man who hired me." The kitchen was very quiet. "He built the nonprofit for Kellen," she said. "That's what the document tells me. He provided the seed funding through the holding company, which means he established the relationship between Kellen and the political network before Kellen had the resources to do it himself." She put both hands flat on the table. Sung-jin didn't just know about Kellen's operation. He built the infrastructure Kellen needed to run it. Do-yun stood very still. "How long have you trusted him?" she asked. 11 years. The number sat between them. "He's the one who gave Kellen my phone number," she said. He was the peripheral contact. He knew the number, not the location. "That's what I said earlier, someone who had access to contact information, but not to the safe house details." She looked up at Do-yun. "He's been Kellen's inside contact inside your organization the entire time." "You're certain?" "I am certain about what the documents say." "I am telling you what the documents say." She held his gaze. "What the documents say is that your CFO has been funding your underboss's parallel infrastructure for at least the 4 years these records go back. Possibly longer." Do-yun turned and walked back to the couch. Not because he needed to sit, she could see that it wasn't about that. He turned away because he needed a moment where she couldn't see his face, and she understood. And she looked down at the table and gave it to him. She heard him sit. She heard him breathe. "He disappears tonight," Do-yun said finally. His voice was what it always was. She didn't know how he did that. "Wait," she said. "Imani?" "Wait," she turned to face him. "If Sungjin disappears tonight, Kellen knows within the hour that we found the link. He knows we've been in these files. He changes everything he can change and burns everything he can't." She shook her head. "We need Sungjin to believe we haven't found this yet. We need him to keep operating normally for at least another 6 hours while I finish the cascade." Do-yun looked at her. "You're asking me to leave him in place. I'm asking you to leave him in place for 6 hours. Then he stops being useful, and you can do whatever you need to do." She paused. "But not tonight. Not yet." The silence was the kind that had weight. 6 hours, he said. "Maybe less. I'm moving faster than I projected." He nodded once. She turned back to the laptop. She did not say what she was also thinking, which was that Sungjin's presence in the structure changed the cascade map fundamentally. Because Sungjin had access to Do-yun's books, as well the legitimate ones. The ones that formed the legal shell around everything else. If he was Kellen's man, then Kellen potentially had visibility into vulnerabilities in Do-yun's own structure that he hadn't shown yet. Was keeping in reserve. She added a new page to the legal pad and started mapping this additional problem. Her hand moved steadily. Her stomach was not steady. She made a decision to be aware of the distinction and continue working. At 2:17 in the morning, Do-yun's phone rang. She knew from the way he answered one word in Korean, with a specific tension in his posture, that it was bad. She kept her eyes on the screen, but she was not reading the screen anymore. She was listening to the cadence of what she couldn't understand. He hung up after 4 minutes. "Sungjin called Kellen," he said. She turned. "When?" 30 minutes ago. One of my people intercepted the communication." He stood up again. The movement was more careful than earlier, which meant the wound was stiffening rather than improving. "He told Kellen we're at a safe house. He doesn't know the location, but he told him the safe house exists and that you've been in the files. So he did know we were looking. He had a monitoring alert on the holding company documents. When you accessed the fiduciary filing, he got a notification." She pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose. "Of course he did. He built the structure. He'd have alerts on sensitive access." She breathed in. "How much of my work has Kellen already seen?" "Unknown." Sungjin transmitted a summary, not the full access log. She thought about the cascade map. 3 hours of work. The intervention points. The sequence. If Kellen had even a partial picture of the sequence, he could move to protect the most critical nodes before she could execute. "I have to move now," she said. "Not 6 hours now. Some of the interventions require, I know what they require." I built the map. She was already typing. The offshore lag I mentioned, the Cayman window, I was going to use it for the final 2 steps. I can reverse the order and use it for the first 2 instead. It changes the cascade, but it still cascades. Her fingers were moving. The political network takes longer to unravel without the nonprofit as a foundation. But if I freeze the nonprofit's operating accounts first, the downstream payments stop automatically within 48 hours. You can freeze the nonprofit's accounts. I can file a flag with the financial institution's compliance system that triggers an automatic review hold. It won't look like interference. It'll look like a routine AML screening hit. She paused. "I've been doing Do-yun's books for 6 months. I know exactly what a routine AML screening hit looks like because I've filed 3 of them to protect his accounts from exactly this kind of flag." She heard him make a sound that she chose not to interpret and went back to the screen. The first intervention took 11 minutes. The nonprofit's primary operating account flagged for review. She confirmed the hold, closed the window, moved to the second intervention. The second one was the Singapore consulting firm. She didn't have direct access to its account. She hadn't expected to need it because the original cascade sequence had approached this from the downstream side. Reversing the order meant she needed to come at it from a different angle. She sat with this for 90 seconds. It felt like longer. Then she found the angle. The consulting firm's payments flowed through a correspondent banking relationship with a mid-tier American institution. The correspondent relationship had a compliance contact. She had the compliance contact's information because she had researched this institution 2 months ago for an unrelated Hanul Pacific matter and had filed the contact in the folder she kept for banking relationships. She had a folder for banking relationships. She had a folder for almost everything. She drafted the compliance inquiry, sent it from a legitimate address that she had standing authority to use. The inquiry cited 3 specific transaction patterns that would be genuinely concerning to a compliance officer and were also, she confirmed by looking at the records, actually present in the transaction history. She was not inventing the red flags. She was directing attention to real ones. She told herself this distinction mattered. She was not entirely sure she believed herself, but she told herself anyway. Send 2 down, she said. The operational payments are next. The 14 individuals, 12 now, 2 of the LLCs dissolved last quarter. I saw the filings when I was building the map. The remaining 12 are the live ones. She moved to the next window. These are harder because the payments are already in transit. I can't stop what's already moving. I can stop the next cycle. When is the next cycle? 4 days, she did not look up. Which means for 4 days, those 12 individuals continue to receive operational support. 4 days is, I know, she finally looked up. I know it's not ideal. But interfering with in-transit funds requires a mechanism I don't currently have access to, and building that access would take longer than 4 days. I'm working within the actual constraints, not the ideal ones. He was quiet. Then, what do you need that you don't have? She looked back at the screen. She had been thinking about this for the last 20 minutes, while her hands were working on other things. The question she hadn't asked out loud yet. The master access, she said. The encryption key for the accounts that sit above both your structure and Kellen's. The ones that were established before either of you. She stopped. She had found something in the file structure she hadn't expected to find. She clicked deeper into it. Imani. Hold on. She followed the thread. A sound Siegfriedson. It went somewhere that made the cascade map she'd spent 3 hours building. Suddenly, feel like she had been mapping the first floor of a building without knowing there were 12 floors above it. The accounts were old. Not Kellen old, not Do-yun's operation old. These accounts predated Hanul Pacific by 7 years. They predated Do-yun's control of the organization by, she calculated, at least a decade. And Sungjin's name was on them, not as a beneficial owner. As a trustee, she sat very still. Sungjin didn't work for Kellen, she said slowly. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Kellen worked for Sungjin. She heard Do-yun's breathing change. Just slightly. Just enough. The whole time, she said. The organization, your organization, the structure underneath it that you thought you controlled. Sungjin has been running it. Not from the outside. From inside. From the financial foundation. She turned the laptop to face him again. You didn't bring him in. 11 years ago, you were brought in. To run the visible operation. To be the face. She looked at him. He picked you. The kitchen light buzzed very faintly. She had not noticed it before. Do-yun looked at the screen for a long time. She watched him look at it. She watched him do what he did, contain it, process it, make it into something he could work with, rather than something that was working on him. He was very good at this. He was not perfect at it. She could see at the edges what this was costing. The accounts he controls, Do-yun said. What's the total exposure? She had the number. She had calculated it while she was working through the other things, because her brain produced numbers the way other people's brains produced reflexive reactions automatically, without being asked. She told him the number. He closed his eyes for 2 seconds. Then he opened them. Can you access those accounts? Not with what I have. She turned the laptop back. The encryption on those structures is different from everything else in these files. Sungjin built the outer structures with commercial-grade security. These core accounts have something else on them, something custom. I've never seen this particular architecture before. But you can break it. She looked at the laptop. She looked at the architecture in question, which was elegant in a way that almost nothing else she'd seen tonight was elegant. Whoever had built this had known exactly what they were doing and had built it to last. I don't know, she said. It cost her to say it. I don't know if I can break it in the time we have. How long would you need? Without knowing what I'm dealing with. 36 hours minimum. Probably more. We don't have 36 hours. I know we don't have 36 hours. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something in his face went very still in the way that meant the information was bad, and he was deciding how to process it before he spoke. What, she said. Not a question, a demand. Kellen's moving on this location. He set the phone down. Someone gave him an address. Sung-jin didn't have the address. Sung-jin had access to the account structure. The account structure has a routine maintenance firm. The maintenance firm has service records for this property. He stood up, already moving past the pain toward whatever his operational mode was when things became urgent. He found it through the property management, not through me. She was already closing the laptop, picking up the legal pad. The cascade map, she needed the cascade map. She had not yet finished the cascade. How long? She said. 20 minutes. Less if he had people already moving when he got the address. She looked at the legal pad, looked at the laptop, made the calculation. I need 10 minutes, she said. Imani, 10 minutes and I can finish the critical interventions. Not all of them. The ones that matter most. She opened the laptop again. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this and filed it. You have people you can call. Call them. Give me 10 minutes. He looked at her. Something moved in his face that she stored for later, because she did not have space for it right now. He picked up his phone and made a call. She went back to the screen. Her fingers moved faster than they had all night. The interventions she executed in the next 10 minutes were rougher than what she'd built in the cascade map, less elegant, less precise, more aggressive. She was not building a surgical operation anymore. She was building a fire, and the goal was to let it spread to the right things before anyone could stop at it. Kellen's 14 operational LLC accounts, she had said 4 days. She had said she couldn't stop in transit funds. That was true with the tools she'd been using. She stopped using those tools. What she did instead was something she had known was possible for the last 2 hours, and had been deliberately not doing because it was irreversible and aggressive, and the kind of action that, once taken, could not be explained away as a compliance error or a regulatory flag. It was the kind of action that, if examined by the wrong person at the wrong time, would be recognized immediately for what it was. She took the action. She executed it across all 12 accounts simultaneously, using an access credential that Do-yun had given her 6 months ago for emergency use, that she had never used, that she had carried in the back of her memory like a key on a ring she'd hoped never to need. The accounts froze. Not a flag, not a review hold. A full operational freeze, executed through a backdoor compliance mechanism that existed precisely because someone, at some point in the design of these banking systems, had understood that there would be situations where standard tools were not sufficient. She sat back. The screen showed 12 frozen accounts. She was breathing harder than she'd realized. Done, she said. Do-yun was still on the phone. He finished his sentence, listened briefly, hung up. He looked at her. You're done? The critical interventions. Not all of them. She closed the laptop, stood up. The core accounts, Sung-jin's core accounts, I couldn't get into those. Not tonight. That's still a problem. We're leaving. I know we're leaving. She picked up her bag. The legal pad went inside it. The laptop, she looked at it. This comes with us. Yes. She picked it up. They moved toward the back of the house, the way they'd come in, and she was aware of the particular quality of moving through a space when you know someone might be approaching the front of it. The night outside was cold and quiet. Do-yun's people, she had not seen them come, but they were here, 2 of them, positioned at the rear of the property, moved them quickly to a car that was not her car and not a car she recognized. She sat in the back seat. Do-yun beside her, the car moved. She looked at the laptop in her hands and thought about Sung-jin. 11 years. The man who had hired her, who had handed her the reconciliation file in her 3rd week that had first shown her the 2nd set of accounts. Who had been, she now understood, not making an error in handing her that file. Testing her. He had been testing her in her 3rd week to see what she would do with information she wasn't supposed to have. And she had done what she had always done, closed it, processed it, come back the next morning, said nothing. She had passed his test, and he had watched her for 18 months from inside the organization, understanding her value before Do-yun had articulated it. Which meant Sung-jin had known, when he confirmed their location tonight, that she was the one in those files. He had not been trying to help Kellen find Do-yun. He had been trying to flush her out. She opened her mouth to say this. Her phone rang. Not her personal phone. The second phone, the one Do-yun had given her 6 months ago for use only with organizational business, the one with the number she had told Kellen not to call again. The number on the screen was not Kellen's. It was a number she recognized from the organizational contact list. A number she had filed under a name she now understood differently than she had filed it this morning. Park Sung-jin. She looked at Do-yun. He looked at the phone. She answered it. You're faster than I expected. Sung-jin's voice was calm. He had the voice of a man in his late 60s who had been doing something for a very long time and had stopped being surprised by most of it. The accounts. That was aggressive. Impressive, but aggressive. She said nothing. I want you to understand, Sung-jin said, that I don't have any interest in harming you. I never did. You're precisely the kind of person this organization needs. A pause. The question is which version of this organization you end up serving. I'm listening, she said. Her voice was completely flat. The accounts you froze belong to a structure that was built to outlast any single leader. Kellen was never meant to win this confrontation. He was meant to pressure Do-yun into a position where restructuring became necessary. Another pause. You accelerated the timeline considerably. That's fine. The outcome is the same. What outcome? Do-yun steps back from operational control. A new structure emerges. And she could hear something in his voice that was not warmth, but was its nearest cold approximation. Take a position commensurate with what you've demonstrated tonight. She looked at Do-yun. He was listening. She could tell he was hearing Sung-jin's voice through the phone or reading her face, or both. You want me to work for you, she said. I want you to understand that you already do, Sung-jin said. You have since the day I handed you that reconciliation file and watched you decide to stay. The only question remaining is whether you make this choice consciously or whether you continue to believe you're making independent decisions inside a structure I designed. The car moved through the dark streets. She thought about the Cascade map, the 10 minutes of aggressive work, the accounts she'd frozen, the core accounts she hadn't been able to crack. She thought about the encryption architecture on Sung-jin's core accounts, the custom design she'd called elegant, the one she'd said would take 36 hours to break. She understood, sitting in the back seat of a car moving through Philadelphia at 3 in the morning, that she had been looking at it wrong. She hadn't been unable to break it because she lacked the skill. She'd been unable to break it because she'd been using the wrong key. And the man on the phone had the right key, and he knew she'd figured that out. What do you want from me specifically, she said. Not the general version, the specific ask. Bring me the laptop, Sung-jin said. Bring me the laptop, Sung-jin said. She looked at the laptop in her hands. She looked at Do-yun beside her in the back seat of the moving car. The city outside was dark and indifferent, streetlights sliding past in a rhythm that had nothing to do with urgency. Do-yun was watching her face, not the phone. Her face, because her face was where the information was. She made a decision. It took approximately 4 seconds. A sound like green wood splitting. It was the kind of decision that felt fast only because the thinking underneath it had been happening for the last 40 minutes without her consciously directing it. Where? She said into the phone. You know the Hanul Pacific Annex on Dickinson Street. The secondary warehouse. A pause. 1 hour. Come alone. I'm not coming alone, Imani. I'm not coming alone, she said again. That's not negotiable. Everything else we can discuss when I get there. The silence on the other end was not surprised. It was calculating. She could hear the difference. Fine, Sung-jin said. 1 hour. He hung up. She lowered the phone. Do-yun was still watching her. I need you to trust me, she said. I do trust you. No, I need you to trust me in the specific way where you don't ask questions for the next 4 minutes while I think. She set the phone in her lap. Can you do that? He was quiet. Which was yes, she thought. The cascade she'd built tonight was not finished. The critical interventions were done: the frozen accounts, the nonprofit flag, the Singapore compliance inquiry. But Sung Jin's core accounts were still intact. 11 years of accumulated resources, sitting behind an encryption architecture she hadn't been able to crack because she'd been using the wrong approach. She had been thinking about it as a lock that needed picking. It wasn't a lock. It was a door that had been built to open from the inside, which meant the key wasn't a piece of software or a credential exploit. The key was a person. Specifically, it was Sung Jin himself and the authentication protocol he used to access those accounts, which would be biometric, device-bound, or both. She needed him to open the door himself, without knowing that was what he was doing. She looked at Do-yun. "He's going to offer me a position," she said. "At the meeting, he'll frame it as a choice work for the structure he controls, or face the consequences of having made an enemy of that structure." She watched Do-yun's face. "He's not going to threaten me directly. He's smarter than that. He'll make the offer sound like the obvious, rational decision. And Kellen is a liability. Sung Jin is already planning to retire. He served his purpose. The pressure campaign against you worked. It created the conditions. Sung Jin needed to force a restructuring." She looked at the laptop in her hands. "Kellen doesn't know that. He thinks he's winning. He's walking into a disposal, probably at the same meeting or shortly after it." She sets the laptop up on the seat beside her. "Which means we have a window where both of them are in the same location and neither of them is fully watching the other one. You want to use that window? I want to use that window to finish what I started tonight." She looked at him steadily. "But I need something from you first. Name it." "The master encryption key. The one you said was for emergency use only." She held his gaze. "The one that sits above everything else in your organizational structure. I know you have one. Every organization this size has a break glass credential at the top of the stack. I need it." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him thinking not the surface, thinking of tactical calculation, but something deeper and less comfortable. The thinking of someone being asked to hand over the last piece of leverage they have in a situation where leverage is the only remaining resource. "If I give you that," he said, "you have access to everything." "Yes. Including the accounts that fund my operation." "Yes. You could walk away from this building tonight and take everything with you." She looked at him. The streetlights kept sliding past. "I know." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He produced a small black card, physical, not digital, the kind of physical credential that, precisely because digital credentials had failure modes that physical ones didn't. He held it for a moment. Then he placed it in her hand. She closed her fingers around it. The card was warm from being against his body. "Don't get killed," he said. "I'll add that to the list," she said. The Hanul Pacific Annex on Dickinson Street was a functional building, one of 3 secondary warehouses the company operated for overflow cargo and document storage. She had processed the lease renewals for it twice. She knew its floor plan from the insurance filings she'd handled last spring. She knew it had 2 loading dock entrances, a secondary exit through the document storage section on the north side, and a mezzanine office level above the main warehouse floor where the building manager worked during business hours. It was 3:47 in the morning when the car stopped 1 block east of the building. Do-yun's 2 men were already repositioning. She didn't ask how the operational logistics of how Do-yun moved people around the city in the middle of the night were outside her expertise, and she had enough to manage inside her expertise. She looked at the building through the car window. 1 interior light on the mezzanine level. The loading dock doors were closed, but not locked. She could see the gap in the left side door from here. "He's already inside," she said. "Yes." Do-yun's voice beside her was the operational voice. The one without texture. "How do you want to do this?" She picked up the laptop. The black card was in the right front pocket of her coat. The legal pad was in her bag, but the map was in her head. She had put it there during the drive, transferred it from paper to memory the way she always did with things she needed to keep close. "I go in first," she said. "Alone, you wait." She turned to look at him. "He needs to believe I'm considering his offer. If he sees you, the dynamic changes and I lose the window." She paused. "He's not going to hurt me in the first 10 minutes. He wants something from me, And after 10 minutes? Depends on whether I get what I need before then. Imani. His voice changed on her name, just slightly. Just enough that it stopped being the operational voice. If he has people in there, he probably does. They won't move without his instruction, and he won't give that instruction while he still thinks he can recruit me. She looked at him. That's the bet. It's not a good bet, but it's the only one I have. He looked at her for a moment that was slightly too long to be purely tactical. I'll be listening, he said. He held up a device the size of a pen cap. Leave the line open. She took the device, clipped it inside her collar where it wouldn't catch light. She got out of the car. The warehouse floor smelled like industrial solvent and old cardboard. She moved through the loading dock entrance, with the laptop under her left arm and her right hand free, which was not because she had a weapon she didn't, but because having a hand free was simply a better position than not having one. The mezzanine light was above her. She could see the stairs at the far end of the warehouse's floor, a metal staircase bolted to the interior wall. The floor itself was dark, except for what filtered down from above. She walked toward the stairs. Her footsteps on the concrete were quieter than she'd expected. She'd worn flat shoes this morning, 17 years of lifetime ago when she'd been a woman going to work, and flat shoes were quieter than heels on concrete. She noted this and kept moving. Sung-jin was at the top of the stairs. He was so smaller than she remembered from the office, not physically, but contextually. In the office, he had always occupied the particular space of an authority figure, the CFO, the man whose office was 2 doors down from Do-yun's, the man who had interviewed her with precise and attentive questions and offered her the position the same afternoon. Here, in a warehouse at 4 in the morning, he was just a man in his late 60s in a good coat, standing at the top of a metal staircase. She climbed the stairs. He watched her come up. "You came," he said. I said I would. You also said you wouldn't come alone. I said that so you'd know the terms. She reached the top of the stairs and stood on the mezzanine, which was narrow, maybe 8 feet wide, running the length of the north wall. There was a folding table, 2 chairs, a laptop she didn't recognize open. She noted all of this without making her noting visible. "I'm here to understand what you actually want." Sung-jin studied her face. He had the eyes of someone who had spent decades reading people for professional purposes, and she was aware of being read. But she was also, she thought, reasonably difficult to read when she chose to be. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." He accepted this. He moved to the far chair and sat, which put the folding table between them and the wall behind him. She noted the positioning. He'd chosen it deliberately. The wall behind him meant no one could approach from that direction, and the table gave him a surface he could use. She was standing between him and the staircase. He didn't seem troubled by this. He should have been. "You understand what you found tonight," he said. "Not a question. I understand what the documents tell me." She set the laptop on the table, not open, not within his reach. "You've been the operational architect of this organization since before Do-yun was running it. You brought him in to run the visible structure, and you maintained control of the financial core." "Correct. You've been building toward a restructuring for approximately 2 years. Kellen was the mechanism, the internal pressure that would force Do-yun into a diminished position." "Also correct. You had me hired because I was the kind of financial mind the restructured organization would need. You vetted me through the reconciliation test in my 3rd week, and I passed it." She looked at him. "You've been watching me develop inside this organization for 18 months, waiting for me to become exactly what I became tonight." Sung-jin tilted his head slightly. "You're faster than I expected. I thought it would take another 6 months. The crisis accelerated my timeline." "I know, I accelerated it on purpose." She felt something cold move through her. Not fear, colder than fear and more specific. "You escalated Kellen's behavior deliberately." "I gave him information that made him impatient." "Yes." He said it without apology, the way people state facts they don't consider morally categorizable. He was always going to move against Do-yun, eventually. "I simply ensured it happened on a timeline that served my purposes." Do-yun got stabbed. The knife was Kellen's independent decision. "I didn't instruct the violence." A pause. "I regret that particular detail." You regret it. It introduced variables I hadn't fully accounted for. His eyes moved to the laptop. Including you removing him from the building before I could establish the conditions I needed. She looked at him. What conditions? I needed Do-yun to understand that the organization's survival depended on a restructuring. That's a conversation that's easier to have when someone is frightened and isolated and in pain. He said this calmly. Instead, you stabilized him. You drove him to the safe house. You gave him a night to recover. He sounded, she thought, almost respectful. You made him harder to manage. That was the idea. I know. That's why I'm talking to you instead of him. He leaned forward slightly. You have the master credential. I know he gave it to you. It's what I would have done in his position, which means you have access to everything in the organizational structure, including the legitimate Hanul Pacific accounts. She said nothing. What I'm offering you, Sung-jin said, is the other half. My accounts, the core accounts you couldn't access tonight. A sound combined with what you already have, you would control the complete financial architecture of everything that's been built over the last 11 years. He looked at her steadily. That's not a secretary position. That's not even a CFO position. That's the kind of control most people in this world never come within sight of. And Do-yun steps back from operational leadership. He's provided with a generous arrangement. He's not harmed. He's not exposed. He simply becomes less central. A pause. He's been running a criminal organization for 11 years, Imani. He knew the nature of that work. This is a business reorganization, not a punishment. She looked at the laptop on the table. Her laptop. She looked at his laptop, open beside it. She looked at Sung-jin. I want to see the core accounts, she said, before I agree to anything. I want to see what I'm actually being offered. Sung-jin studied her for another moment. Then he reached for his laptop and turned it to face her. The authentication screen was open. She could see the biometric prompt fingerprint, waiting. Show me, she said. He pressed his thumb to the reader. The screen unlocked. She leaned forward as if to look at the accounts. She looked at the screen. She also, without moving her right hand visibly, reached into her coat pocket. A sound like green wood splitting. The black card Do-yun had given her had one relevant feature she had not explained to him in the car because she had not been certain it would work, and explaining a plan that might not work was something she had learned to avoid. The card contained a master credential, yes. But master credentials in systems, this sophisticated, were not simply passwords. They were relational authenticated against a specific system architecture. A sound like green wood splitting, the credential worked by establishing a connection to the organizational system's root access layer, and then confirming the credential against the existing authenticated sessions. If Sung-jin was currently authenticated into the core accounts, and she established a root access connection within that authentication window, the system would recognize her credential as operating within a confirmed session and extend access. It would work for approximately 90 seconds before the session recognized the anomaly. She needed 90 seconds. She plugged the black card's embedded connector into her laptop's port under the table's edge. She did this by touch, without looking down, while keeping her eyes on Sung-jin's screen and asking him a question about the account structure that required him to click through several layers to demonstrate. He clicked. She listened. Her right hand, under the table, confirmed the connection by feel. She heard the faintest vibration, not audible to anyone else, barely audible to her, that meant the connection was establishing. 60 seconds. The Cayman structures, she said. Those are the oldest accounts. Walk me through how they're organized. He clicked deeper. He was explaining. She understood, genuinely proud of what he'd built. The explanation had the quality of craftsmanship being revealed to someone with the capacity to appreciate it. He wanted her to be impressed, because he wanted her to want what he was offering. She was listening to the explanation and also counting. 40 seconds, and the authentication for access transfers. How does that work when primary authorization is unavailable? He looked up from the screen. Something shifted in his face. Not quite suspicion. The beginning of a question. Why do you ask about authentication transfers specifically? 20 seconds. She held his gaze. Because if I'm going to take control of these accounts, I need to understand the succession protocol. What happens to access if something happens to you? The question was reasonable enough that he answered it. He looked back at the screen and started to explain the succession mechanism. She felt the second vibration under her hand. Access confirmed. She straightened. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was completely level. She pulled the card free under the table edge and closed her laptop with her left hand in the same motion. Sung Jin looked at her. The question was back in his face, clearer now. Then his phone buzzed on the table. He looked at it. His face changed in a way she had never seen a face change, not the quick change of surprise, but the slow change of something very certain suddenly becoming uncertain. He looked up at her. "What did you do?" he said. "What you brought me here to do," she said. "I accessed the accounts." He reached for his laptop. The authentication screen had changed. The session was still open, but there was an additional active connection, visible in the session manager, a connection established from a different device sites that makes us executing a series of administrative functions. Not reading the accounts, restructuring the access controls. She had not transferred money. She had not moved funds. She had done something more fundamental and more irreversible. She had added herself as a co-administrator of every account in Sung Jin's core structure, with independent authentication that did not require his credential or his device or his thumb on a biometric reader. "You need me to access those accounts now," she said. "You cannot move money, change structures, or modify access without my co-authorization." She picked up her laptop. "Which means you don't have a restructuring without my agreement. You have a very expensive set of locked boxes." Sung Jin's face was doing something she found genuinely interesting to watch. Not anger, not yet. The cold recalculation of someone extremely intelligent encountering an outcome they hadn't modeled. "You had a root access credential," he said. "He trusted me with it. Nobody carries a master credential to a meeting like this unless..." He stopped. "Unless they came here to use it. Yes." She tucked the laptop under her arm. "You spent 18 months watching me develop. You brought me into this organization to be exactly this. You didn't account for who I'd decide to be once I got here." Behind her, she heard the metal staircase. She did not turn. She knew the footstep pattern. She had been listening to it for 3 months, from a desk directly outside a mahogany door, the sound of a specific person's specific walk on a specific kind of floor. Do-yun reached the top of the stairs. He was pale and moving carefully, and his left hand was pressed against his side, and he looked, she thought, it's like someone who had decided that staying in the car was not an option he was capable of choosing. He took in the room, the table, Sung Jin, her standing between them. Sung Jin looked at Do-yun, and something broke on Sung Jin's face. Not dramatically, quietly, which was worse. 11 years of a specific kind of relationship collapsed into a folding table and 2 laptops and a woman standing in the middle. "Do-yun," Sung Jin said. Do-yun said nothing. He looked at the man who had built the organization he'd believed he led, who had hired the woman now standing in his safe house with his master credential in her coat pocket, who had been running a patient and elaborate long game from the inside of something Do-yun had believed was his own. The silence was a very specific kind of terrible. It was Imani who broke it. "Kellen is coming," she said, not to Sung Jin, to Do-yun. He got the location from Sung Jin's people, not from the property records. Sung Jin gave it to him because he needed Kellen in the same room tonight. She looked at Sung Jin. "You are going to use this meeting to stage the handover. Kellen delivers Do-yun, and you reward Kellen with what? A percentage, an independent territory. Something that would keep him manageable for another few years before you retired him. The same way you plan to retire everyone else who got close enough to be a problem." Sung Jin looked at her. He was very still. "You figured that out on the drive over." "I figured it out 20 minutes ago. I've been thinking about when to say it." She looked at the staircase behind Do-yun. "How far out is Kellen?" "Close." Do-yun's voice. "My people are 2, and Kellen is bringing more than 2. She looked at the floor plan she'd memorized from the insurance filings. "Document storage, north exit. Mezzanine has a secondary access panel in the east wall, installed during the last renovation, listed in the building specs as a fire egress route. There's a secondary exit from this level. East wall behind the shelving unit. She looked at Sung-jin. You know about it. Yes. You were going to use it tonight. After the handover, Sung-jin said nothing, which was yes. She looked at Do-yun. Can you move fast? Faster than I look. That is genuinely not a high bar right now. She picked up her bag. Sung-jin is coming with us. Sung-jin stood up. I'm not. You don't have a choice. She looked at him with the specific steadiness of someone who has, in the last 6 hours, stopped flinching at the shape of things. You built the financial core of this organization, and you installed yourself as the only person who could manage it. That was your protection. I just made that protection shared. She met his eyes. Which means your value to anyone who wants to use you as leverage just dropped significantly, and your value to me as the person who now co-controls those accounts just went up considerably. She paused. Kellen doesn't know any of that. He knows you're in this building, and he's coming here to collect on a promise you made him. How long do you think your arrangement with him survives once he realizes you've lost access to the thing you promised him? Sung-jin stood. He stood with the specific posture of someone very intelligent absorbing the full scope of a situation they have lost control of and deciding what the rational position is from here. He walked toward the east wall. Do-yun moved to her side. She felt him, the heat of him and the effort the movement was costing, and she kept her eyes forward, but her awareness of him was complete. You accessed the accounts, he said quietly, walking beside her. Yes. You used the master credential I gave you. Yes. And now Sung-jin needs your authorization to access his own accounts. That's correct. A pause. You understand what that means for the organization going forward. I have some thoughts about what it means for the organization going forward. She glanced at him. We can discuss those when we're not about to encounter Kellen Rourke. He made a sound. It was the closest she'd ever heard him come to something that was almost in another life, and considerably better circumstances, a laugh. The east wall had a shelving unit bolted to it, tall industrial, the kind used for document boxes. Sung-jin pressed a recess on the third shelf bracket, and the unit swung out on a pivot, revealing a door behind it. Operational. The hinges were maintained. Of course they were. He would have maintained them himself. The door opened into a secondary staircase metal, utilitarian, descending parallel to the east wall of the building. She went first, laptop under her arm, bag over her shoulder, moving downstairs in the dark by handrail and memory of a floor plan. Behind her she heard Do-yun, behind him Sung-jin. Below them, she heard the loading dock doors, the main ones, on the south side of the building open. Kellen's voice carried through the structure. She couldn't make out words from here, but she could make out the cadence of someone who had arrived expecting a situation and was beginning to read the room as different from what he'd expected. She moved faster on the stairs. The bottom of the secondary staircase opened into a corridor that ran along the east foundation of the building toward the north exit. She ran it not elegantly, not quietly. Her shoes on concrete, and her breath harder than she wanted it to be, and she hit the north exit bar with both hands, and the door opened into cold air and a back alley, and the specific absence of Kellen Rourke. She stopped, Do-yun behind her, Sung-jin behind him. She looked at the alley, looked at her phone, sent one text to the number she'd been given for Do-yun's people. North exit now. She looked at Sung-jin. He was breathing harder than she was. He was 67 years old, and he'd just run a staircase in a good coat. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, his actual age. You're going to tell me, she said, while they waited, every account, every structure, every political contact, every arrangement you've maintained for 11 years. All of it. She looked at him steadily. In exchange, I don't send the fiduciary documents from the holding company to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division tonight. Sung-jin looked at her. He looked at Do-yun. He looked back at her. You'd expose yourself as well, he said. I'd expose the documents. What I was doing with them is a matter of interpretation. She held his gaze. Your name is on the beneficial ownership records. Mine isn't. Inside the building, Kellen's voice rose sharply. He'd reached the mezzanine, found the table, the 2 laptops she'd left there. She'd taken her own, but left his and the open secondary exit. The sound that came through the building walls was not a word exactly. Do-yun's people came around the corner of the alley at a controlled run, not the frantic run of panic, but the compressed efficiency of people who had been positioned and waiting for a text. The car was 30 feet from the north exit. She moved toward it. Do-yun reached her side. His hand found her arm, not gripping, not restraining, just present, the contact of someone establishing that both of them were still here and still moving. She kept walking. Behind them, inside the building, Kellen Rourke was standing on a mezzanine with a table and an open exit, and the understanding that something had happened tonight that he did not yet have the shape of. She got in the car. Do-yun got in beside her. Sung-jin, after a moment that was its own entire decision, got in on the other side. The car moved. She opened the laptop on her knees, the screen casting pale light across her hands, and she looked at the administrative access panel for the core accounts, Sung-jin's core accounts, now requiring her co-authorization, sitting open in front of her with the particular weight of something that has changed hands and knows it. She looked at the accounts for a long moment. Then she looked out the window at the city moving past, dark and enormous and entirely unaware, and she thought about what she was going to do next. And she thought about the cost of it. And she thought about the word Do-yun had used in this car several hours and an entire other life ago. Together, she looked at the accounts again. Her hands in the pale light of the screen were perfectly still. The car moved through Philadelphia's pre-dawn dark with the specific silence of people who have passed through something and not yet found the words for what it was. Imani kept the laptop open on her knees. The administrative panel for the core accounts sat on the screen and she looked at it without touching it, because there were things you needed to sit with before you acted on them, and this was one of those things. The numbers were enormous. The structure was elegant. Sung-jin had built it over 11 years, with the patience of someone who had decided very early that patience was the only resource that reliably compounded. She understood that now in a way she hadn't at the beginning of the night. Sung-jin sat on the far side of the back seat, separated from her by Do-yun, and he looked out the window at the city with the expression of someone doing a final accounting. Not grief exactly, something more professional than grief. The recognition of a long-running enterprise reaching its conclusion by a route he hadn't planned for. Do-yun was breathing carefully. The wound was stiffening, she could tell by the deliberateness of each breath, the way he held his left side without appearing to hold it, the small effort visible in his jaw. He needed a hospital. She was going to say this again, and he was going to refuse again, and she was going to have to find the version of the argument he couldn't dismiss. The political contacts, she said. She was talking to Sung-jin. You said you'd tell me everything. I said that under duress. You said it because it was the rational position, and it still is. She didn't look up from the screen. The deputy director at the Port Authority, the 3 council members, the state representative. How long have they been on the arrangement? Sung-jin was quiet for a moment. Then the Port Authority contact 7 years. The others varying. The longest is 9 years. What are they paid annually? He told her. She noted the amounts without reacting to them, though the amounts were significant. And the payments have been running through the workforce development nonprofit. Until tonight, yes. The nonprofit's operating accounts are frozen pending compliance review. She finally looked up at him, which means in approximately 72 hours, when the next payment cycle runs and the transfer fails, those 5 individuals are going to start making calls. She held his gaze. What do they do when they can't reach you? Sung-jin's jaw tightened slightly. They look for alternative arrangements. With who? Whoever appears to control the accounts. She looked back at the screen, which is now me. Do-yun turned his head slightly toward her. She felt the movement rather than saw it. I'm not planning to continue paying politicians, she said, to both of them and neither of them. I'm planning to have documentation of every payment that was ever made, which is a different kind of leverage and a considerably more stable one. She closed the laptop. Nobody stays bought forever, but nobody stops being afraid of evidence. The car slowed. They were on a street she didn't immediately recognize, residential, quiet, the kind of block that looked the same in every direction. One of Do-yun's people spoke from the front seat in Korean. New location, Do-yun said. Not the safe house. Somewhere Sung Jin's people haven't had access to. She nodded. The new location was an apartment on the fourth floor of a building in Fairmount, clean, functional, the kind of furnished rental that existed for corporate relocations. Someone had set it up recently. She noted the clean lines of it, the absence of personal objects, the specific impersonality of a space prepared for emergency use. She sat at the kitchen table again. Different kitchen, same position. So there was something almost funny about that. If you had the capacity for finding things funny at 4:30 in the morning after the night she'd had, which she was not entirely certain she did. She opened the laptop. Do-yun stood in the doorway to the main room and looked at her. I need you to stop working for 20 minutes. I need 20 minutes. He said it the way he said things that were not negotiable, which she had spent 18 months learning to distinguish from the things that only appeared not negotiable. This was the real kind. There's food. Eat something. Then we talk. She looked at the laptop. She looked at him. She closed the laptop. There was rice and something preserved. Whoever had stocked the apartment had stocked it practically rather than thoughtfully, but practically was sufficient. She ate standing at the counter because sitting felt like a commitment to stillness she wasn't ready to make. Do-yun sat at the table. He ate slowly, with the careful economy of someone managing pain alongside a meal. Sung Jin was in the main room with one of Do-yun's people watching the door. She could hear him faintly, a low conversation in Korean that she couldn't follow. You should go to a hospital, she said. I know. That's not a no. It's a delayed yes. He set down the fork. In the morning, when this is resolved. Define resolved. He looked at her across the small kitchen. When I know what you're going to do with what you have. She set down her own food. That's what you want to talk about. Among other things, she turned to face him fully, leaning against the counter with her arms folded. Not defensive, she recognized the posture from the outside and made herself unfold her arms. She put her hands flat on the counter instead. Say what you mean. You have the master credential. You have co-authorization on Sung Jin's core accounts. You have the documentation of every political payment this organization has made in the last 9 years. He looked at her steadily. You have more control over this organization right now than anyone has had since Sung Jin built it. Yes, and I gave you the credential voluntarily in a car without conditions. Yes, I want you to understand that I knew what that meant when I did it. He held her gaze. Not as a transaction, not because I calculated the odds of you using it against me, because you had earned it and because he stopped. Started again. Because I have spent 18 months watching you carry something you never agreed to carry and doing it with more integrity than most people bring to work they actually chose. He paused. And because the alternative was letting you walk into that building without the tools you needed, which was not an option I was capable of choosing. She looked at him. The kitchen light was the ordinary fluorescent kind, unflattering, the kind that showed everything. He looked exhausted and injured and entirely unguarded in a way that she had never seen from him in 18 months of daily proximity. You could have told me, she said, a long time ago, about what the organization actually was, about Sung Jin, about the full scope of what you were running. Yes. You didn't. No, because you were protecting me or because you were protecting yourself. He didn't answer immediately. She respected that the pause was honest rather than strategic. Both, he said, initially. And then, later, because I didn't know how to explain that I had let you come in far enough that telling you the truth would put you in danger, and that the danger was partly a consequence of my own choices. He looked at his hands on the table. There is no version of that conversation that reflects well on me. No, she agreed. There isn't. I'm not asking you to. I know you're not asking me to forgive it. I'm noting it because it matters. She's pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. You kept information from me that affected my safety and my choices. That's not something I'm going to explain away or pretend was protective. It was control, even if it didn't feel like that to you. I know. And the surveillance on my mother's debt. Yes, his voice was quiet. That too. She looked at him. At the lines around his eyes that were more visible now than they were. At 9 o'clock this morning. At the way he was sitting, not the controlled, contained posture of the office, but something more honest. A man at a kitchen table at 4:30 in the morning, accounting for himself. "I'm not leaving," she said. He looked up. "I'm not saying that because I'm afraid of Kellen, or because I have nowhere to go, or because you gave me a credential and now I'm obligated." She held his gaze. "I'm saying it because I've thought about it, and the alternative is walking away from the most interesting and most difficult problem I've ever had access to, and I don't want to do that." She paused. "I'm also saying it because you are the only person who has ever looked directly at what I'm capable of and not looked away from it. And that matters to me, even though I wish it mattered less, because it would be simpler." The kitchen was very quiet. "The organization changes," she said. "What I'm willing to be part of, and what I'm not, those are conversations we're going to have, and they're not going to be easy conversations. But we're going to have them." "Yes," he said. "And you go to a hospital in the morning." "Yes." She looked at him for another moment. Then she opened the laptop. "2 more hours," she said. "Then I'm done for tonight." He didn't argue. He sat at the table while she worked, and she was aware of him the way she was aware of the fluorescent light and the sound of the city outside constantly, peripherally, as part of the environment of the thing she was doing rather than separate from it. She found this neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. She found it accurate. Kellen Rourke was arrested at 6:47 in the morning. She did not learn this directly. She learned it through the cascade of communications that moved through Do-yun's network in the 2 hours after she finished working the specific quality of information arriving from multiple directions that meant something. Significant had shifted in the external landscape. She had done, in the final 2 hours of working, was this: she had compiled the documentation. Not selectively, comprehensively, every payment from the workforce development nonprofit to the 5 political contacts. Every wire transfer from the Delaware freight brokerage to the offshore structures. The fiduciary documents from the Cayman holding company with Sungjin's name on them. The LLC registrations, the account histories. And then she had separated the documentation into 2 categories. The first category was everything that implicated Kellen Rourke, his parallel structures, his 8 months of asset version from Do-yun's organization, his operational payments to 14 individuals whose activities were not ambiguous. The category she had transmitted, via an anonymous filing mechanism she was professionally familiar with, to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and simultaneously to the investigative unit at the State Attorney General's office. She had done this carefully. She had done it in a way that would survive legal scrutiny, because it was genuine evidence of genuine crimes rather than manufactured documentation. The crimes were real. The evidence was real. She had simply directed attention to it. The second category, everything that involved Hanul Pacific's deeper structure, Sungjin's core accounts, the political payments, Do-yun's organizational architecture, she had encrypted and stored in 3 locations. Not transmitted, held. This was leverage. It was the kind of leverage that worked precisely because it was not yet deployed. Deployed leverage was just evidence. Undeployed leverage was a condition of the future. She understood the difference. Kellen's arrest came out of the financial crimes, referral moving faster than she'd expected. Someone at the FBI had been waiting for a hook into Kellen's operations. She understood this in retrospect, because the speed of the response suggested existing investigation infrastructure that needed only a trigger. She had provided the trigger. She heard about it when Do-yun came out of the main room at 7:15 and told her. She was still at the kitchen table. She had been awake for, she calculated, 26 hours, approximately, with a 20-minute interruption for food. She felt this in a specific physical way that was distinct from ordinary tiredness, a kind of transparency, as though the ordinary layer between her internal processing and the external world had worn thin. They moved fast, she said. He had warrants pending. Existing investigation. Do-yun sat down across from her. He was moving more carefully than he had been an hour ago, which meant the wound was worse in the morning than it had been at night. You knew there was an existing investigation. I suspected. The speed of the response to my filing confirmed it. She looked at the laptop screen. They've been building toward him. I gave them the financial architecture they were missing. You gave them enough to arrest him without exposing anything connected to Hanul Pacific. Yes, he looked at her. That was deliberate. Everything I did tonight was deliberate. She met his eyes. I protected the legitimate operation. The 72 people who work in the actual shipping business, their jobs survived this. The company's contracts survived this. What doesn't survive is Kellen's parallel structure, which is exactly what shouldn't survive. And Sung Jin. She looked toward the main room. Sung Jin was still there. She could hear him. Quieter now, the low sound of someone who had been up all night, arriving at a different relationship with the morning than they'd expected. Sung Jin is more complicated, she said. How complicated? He built the core infrastructure. He has knowledge of the organization's history that doesn't exist in any document relationships, agreements, contextual information that would take years to reconstruct. She looked at Do-yun. He's also the person who spent 11 years operating the organization from inside. A structure you believed was yours, which is either a betrayal or a business arrangement, depending on how you define the terms. How do you define the terms? I define them as he's more valuable to the organization's stability as a contained asset than as a threat. She paused. Which means he stays. In a reduced capacity, with full transparency about his role and full co-authorization requirements on any account movement above a certain threshold. She held Do-yun's gaze. And he knows that the documentation in Category 2 exists, and what happens to it if he moves in a direction I haven't authorized. Do-yun was quiet for a moment. You're managing him. I'm establishing the terms of a workable arrangement. She looked at her hands on the table. It's what I do. She heard movement from the main room. Sung Jin appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at both of them with the expression of someone who had spent the last 3 hours performing his own accounting and had arrived at a number. You're not going to send the documents, he said to Imani. Not today, she said. Not if we have the conversation we need to have. And what conversation is that? The one where you tell me every piece of organizational history that isn't in any document, and every relationship that exists only in your knowledge, and every arrangement that has no paper trail. She looked at him steadily. And then the one where we discuss what your role looks like going forward. Because the organization needs what you know. And what I need from you is honesty that was not on offer 11 years ago when you decided Do-yun would be useful. Sung Jin looked at Do-yun. There was something between the two of them that she was not entirely part of the history of 11 years moving through a glance in a way that was compressed and unresolvable in a single morning. Do-yun said, "Sit down, Sung Jin." Sung Jin sat down. The conversation took 2 hours. It was the most information-dense. 2 hours of her professional life, including the 48 hours she had spent reconstructing records when the previous accountant disappeared. Sung Jin talked, and she took notes on the legal pad, the same one, which was running out of pages, and Do-yun listened with the particular quality of attention that meant he was revising his understanding of his own history in real time. There were things in that 2 hours that she watched cost Do-yun. Not visibly, he would not allow visible, but she had learned to read the edges, and some of what Sung Jin told him about how the organization had actually been structured, about decisions that had been made on his behalf, without his knowledge, about the degree to which his authority had been real versus performed. She watched it land in the specific way that true things land when they replace false ones. He did not interrupt. He did not react in ways that were not useful. He absorbed it with the discipline she had come to understand was both his greatest professional asset and, in some ways, his most exhausting personal habit. When Sung Jin finished, the legal pad was full, and the kitchen was very quiet, and the morning outside had fully arrived. Thin winter light coming through the window above the counter. Imani closed the legal pad. She looked at Sung Jin. "Thank you." He seemed surprised by that. "You're thanking me. You could have given me less. You chose not to." She looked at him. "That's a decision, not an obligation." He was quiet. "Then, you're going to restructure the whole thing, aren't you?" "Yes. The legitimate operation and the other. The legitimate operation expands. The other," she paused. "The other contracts significantly. I'm not here to run a criminal organization. I'm here to run a financial architecture that keeps 72 people employed and one shipping company solvent." She looked at Do-yun. What it does at its margins is a conversation for another day. Sung-jin looked at the table. Then he looked at his hands. I built something that outlasted my intentions for it. She looked at him. Most things do. Do-yun went to the hospital at 9:15 that morning. She insisted on driving him. He accepted this without argument, which told her the wound was worse than he had been acknowledging, because the version of Do-yun that was managing adequately did not accept things without considering the alternative. The hospital was a private facility, not Hanul Pacific's private facility, which had too many connections. A different one, on the other side of the city, where a doctor who asked minimal questions was available on short notice through a contact she had found in the organizational records at some point in the last 12 hours. She sat in the waiting room while they worked on him. It was a small waiting room, 2 chairs, a table with a lamp, no windows. She sat in one chair and put her bag on the other and leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She was too far past the point where sleep came naturally. But she rested in the way of someone who has finished the acute phase of a crisis and is waiting for the next phase to announce itself. She thought about her mother's apartment, which was 40 minutes from here, by train. She thought about the specific smell of it, the particular combination of her mother's preferred, and the old building's radiator heat, and she thought about the fact that the debt was paid. Had been paid 2 weeks ago, the final transfer processed quietly, unremarkably, like any other financial transaction. Her mother didn't know it was gone yet. She had been waiting for the right moment to explain it. She thought about the right moment. The right moment. The right moment kept moving, and she had come in the last 18 months, that the right moment was a construction she used to delay things she was afraid of. Not afraid of in the way of fear. Afraid of in the way of, this will change something, and I haven't finished preparing for the change. She took out her phone. She wrote a text to her mother. It was not a text about the debt. It was a text that said, I want to come for dinner this week. I have some things to tell you. Nothing bad. Something that changed. She sent it before she could think about whether the timing was right. Her mother's reply came in 4 minutes. With some spin, which meant her mother had been awake at 9:30 on a Wednesday morning, sitting with her phone, a specific way of someone who did not have anyone texting them very often, and picked up quickly when they did. The reply said, I'll make your grandmother's recipe. Come Thursday. She looked at the text for a moment. Then she put the phone in her bag and looked at the wall across from her and let herself feel briefly and completely what the last 24 hours had actually been. Not managed, not processed into the next problem, just felt. The fear which had been present from the beginning and which she had worked around rather than through. The anger at being grabbed by the wrist in front of 32 people who did nothing. The strange steadiness that had descended when Do-yun was bleeding on his office floor, and she had understood that steadiness was the only useful thing available. The moment in the suburban kitchen when he said, stop apologizing for taking up space. The 90 seconds in the warehouse mezzanine when she had done the most technically difficult and morally complex thing she had ever done, and her hands had not shaken once. She let herself feel all of it. It passed through her and settled somewhere, and became part of the permanent record she kept of her own life, filed accurately and without revision. She was a different person than she had been yesterday morning. She had known this would happen at some point. She had not known it would happen all at once. The doctor came out at 11. The wound had been deeper than the bandaging had shown. It was a repair, required nothing surgical but significant. Do-yun would need 2 weeks of actual rest, which she anticipated would be the most difficult professional challenge she had yet encountered, because Do-yun's relationship with rest was theoretical rather than practiced. She said, he'll rest. The doctor looked at her as if assessing whether this was a credible statement. He'll rest, she said again. She was taken to a room that was clean and spare and smelled like antiseptic, and Do-yun was in the bed looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone deeply inconvenienced by their own body's requirements. She sat in the chair beside the bed. How bad, he said. The doctor says 2 weeks of actual rest. His jaw moved. I told him you'd rest, she said. I have 2 weeks, she said. The organization will function. I have the accounts and the documentation and a full set of notes from a 2-hour conversation with the man who built the whole infrastructure. She looked at him. The organization will function. He looked at her. You'll run it. I'll manage the financial architecture. Which is most of what actually matters, as I think this last week has rather demonstrated. She set her bag on the floor beside the chair. Your operational staff can manage the day-to-day. You can consult by phone. 2 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. And after 2 weeks, we have the conversation we said we were going to have. About what the organization looks like going forward. What I'm willing to be part of and what I'm not. She met his eyes. I told you last night those would be hard conversations. I remember. I meant it. I know you meant it. Something moved in his face, not the managed version, but the one that appeared at kitchen tables at 4:30 in the morning and in hospital rooms at 11. I want those conversations. She looked at him in the hospital bed in the spare room, and she thought about 18 months of learning someone slowly and imperfectly, through their actions and their silences, and the way they sent food to a desk, without making it into a gesture. Through the way they had stood in an office doorway and said 2 words, step away, as though the alternative were not a possibility the room needed to consider. There's something I didn't say last night, she said. He waited. When you asked why I didn't run, when I opened the door and saw you against the wall, she looked at her hands in her lap. I said I didn't know. That was half true. She looked up. The other half is that I had been watching you for 6 months, and I knew I didn't think. I knew that you wouldn't have left me. She paused. If the situation were reversed, if it were me against the wall, you would have opened the door. He held her gaze. Yes, I know. She settled back in the chair. That's the other half. The room was quiet. Outside the door, the sounds of the facility moved past at their ordinary pace, entirely indifferent to what had happened in the last 24 hours and what was being decided in this room. Sleep, she said. I'll be here. You haven't slept either. I'll sleep in the chair. She pulled her bag into her lap and took out the legal pad. After I finish transferring these notes somewhere, they won't disappear if someone takes the legal pad. He looked at the legal pad. You're going to work while I sleep. I'm going to do 15 minutes of careful documentation, and then I'm going to sleep in the chair. She looked at him. Which is not ideal, but is significantly better than the alternative, which is going home and being alone with the contents of my own head at this particular moment. He was quiet for a moment. Then stay, I said I was going to. Not just for today. His voice was level, but underneath it was the layer she had learned to hear. I know what I'm asking. I know it's not a simple thing. He held her gaze. But I'm asking. She looked at him. The exhaustion in his face and the honesty of it, which were inseparable right now, in a way that was probably not entirely fair, but was entirely real. I'm already staying, she said. I told you that in the kitchen. You told me you weren't leaving. That's different from staying. She looked at him for a long moment. He was right. The distinction was real, and he had seen it and named it, which was, she thought, one of the things about him that had made this impossible to walk away from, even when walking away had been the obviously safer choice. Yes, she said, I'm staying. He closed his eyes. She opened the legal pad and started transferring notes, and the sounds of the facility continued outside the door, and the winter light moved slowly across the floor. And she worked until her eyes wouldn't stay open anymore. And then she put the legal pad in her bag and settled into the chair and slept. 3 months moved through her life like a season change. Gradual, then sudden, then simply the new condition of things. The Kellen Rourke case moved through federal court with the efficiency of a prosecution that had been building for 2 years before anyone gave it the documents it needed. The financial crimes indictment was 43 pages. She did not read it publicly. She did not need to. Hanul Pacific Logistics restructured. The process was formal, documented, conducted in daylight with actual lawyers who asked real questions and received accurate answers about the legitimate operation. The illegitimate architecture contracted, not eliminated, because she had been honest with herself about what was achievable and what was not, but reduced, clarified, stripped of the most exposing elements, and rebuilt on foundations that were at least partially defensible. Sung Jin remained. He came to the office twice a week, sat in a smaller office than he had previously occupied. and answered questions she put to him with the consistency of someone who understood the terms of his arrangement and had decided that the terms were acceptable. She watched him for signs that he was building something new in the margins and found none. She continued watching anyway. This was not personal, it was professional, and Sung Jin, she thought, respected it. Her mother came to Philadelphia for a weekend in February. Imani took her to dinner at a restaurant she'd been wanting to try for 2 years and had never been able to justify. She told her mother about the debt being paid, all of it, the full number, gone, green, gone, and her mother sat very still for a moment and then reached across the table to her daughter's hand without saying anything, which was exactly right. She did not tell her mother everything. She told her enough. The truth in broad strokes: she had taken a job that was more complicated than it appeared. She had made choices in that complexity that she could stand behind. She was no longer afraid of going to work in the morning. Her mother listened and asked 3 questions, all practical, and then said, "You sound different." Different how? Like you stopped waiting for permission to take up space. Her mother looked at her across the restaurant table. "You've been doing that since you were 11 years old, and I never knew how to fix it." She thought about a kitchen table in a suburban safe house. A man's voice, steady through pain, "Stop apologizing for taking up space, Imani." "I had some help," she said. The reorganization of Hanul Pacific's financial architecture took 11 weeks. At the end of 11 weeks, she sat at a desk that was not outside a mahogany door but inside the executive conference room on the 14th floor, which had been converted into a working financial operations center because she had needed more monitors than a standard office provided, and Do-yun had told facilities to give her whatever she needed. The title on her new business cards said Chief Financial Strategist. She had chosen it herself. It was accurate. She was at the monitors at 7:43 on a Thursday morning when he came in. She recovered. The 2 weeks had become 3 because she had simply not provided the car service back to the office when the original 2 weeks elapsed, and had waited to see if he arranged his own transportation, which he had not, which told her something about what he actually wanted versus what he said he was willing to accept. By the end of the 3rd week, he looked like himself again. The contained, precise version that occupied space with the particular authority of someone who had decided very early that apology was not in his vocabulary. He set a coffee on the monitor desk beside her without announcing it. She picked it up and drank. "Quarterly structure review," she said. "I want 3 hours with you today. I have the Tokyo call at 2. Before the Tokyo call, then 10. She looked at the screens. The accounts, the legitimate revenue streams, which were genuinely solid. Hanul Pacific had real contracts and real clients, and the shipping business operated honestly, was profitable. The other layer, reduced and clarified, and sitting in the architecture like a secondary system whose maintenance she had accepted without enthusiasm and with very clear conditions attached. "The Port Authority contact is going to be a problem," she said. "Which one?" "The deputy director. His payment cycle was interrupted for 6 weeks during the nonprofit freeze. He's been making calls." She looked at the relevant account. "I've been thinking about whether there's a version of this where he becomes undocumented liability rather than a continuing payment." "Explain that." "He's been receiving payments for 7 years. That's 7 years of exposure for him. If someone were to conduct a routine compliance audit of the Port Authority's inspection waivers and find a pattern," she looked at him, "he stops being an asset we pay and becomes someone who needs us to stay quiet, which is a different kind of leverage and considerably cheaper." Do-yun looked at her. "You're describing a negotiation." "I'm describing a reorganization of incentive structures." She looked back at the screen. "It's what I do." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you've changed the way I think about most of this." She looked at him. "Good or bad, different." He held her gaze. "Better, I think. Slower. More careful about what things cost." He paused. "More aware of what I owe people who do work I couldn't do." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the things she had said in a hospital room and the things he had said in return, and how those things had settled into the daily architecture of the last 3 months without a great deal of drama and with a great deal of consistency, which was not the version of this she had imagined when she'd imagined it. She had imagined something more turbulent, but was, she thought, better. Turbulence was not the same as depth. She had learned this slowly, and not without cost. 10 o'clock, she said. 10 o'clock, he agreed. He left her to the monitors. She turned back to the screens and picked up the thread of the quarterly structure review, which was complex and important and required the full quality of attention she was capable of giving it. The morning moved on. The office filled. The sounds of the building's ordinary operations phones, conversation. The particular rhythm of a working floor moved through the space around her, the way weather moved, ambient and real, and noticed only when it changed. At 9:55, she heard the familiar sound of his specific footstep in the corridor. She did not look up. She heard him stop in the conference room doorway. "Ready?" he said. She closed the quarterly projection file and opened the master structure review. The full architecture. 11 weeks of her work and 11 years of Sung Jin's, and the long history of the organizations moving through both of them, like a river that had changed course and was still finding its new banks. "I've been ready for years," she said. She heard him come into the room and take the chair beside her, not across from her, and the chair's specific sound, as he settled into it, the sound of someone choosing where to sit and sitting there without reservation. The review began. Outside the window, Philadelphia was doing what it did in late winter, sharp and cold, and taking itself, the river catching the thin light the same way it always caught it at this hour, indifferent to everything that happened in the building above it, and exactly as it had been on every morning before this one. She had stopped looking at it only during the day. Now she looked at it whenever she wanted to. That was the thing about space she had learned. Stopped apologizing for taking it up, and it was simply there, the way it had always been there, waiting for you to stop making yourself smaller than the room required. She looked at the river for one moment more. Then she looked at the work.